window, instead of the usual view of a busy city and thousands of people rushing about their business, there was water. Seawater with waves. No matter where he looked, it was everywhere. And only all sorts of floating debris floated on its surface. Su Yi simply couldn't believe his eyes. How was this even possible? The only thing visible from under the water were the tops of the tallest buildings in his city. Everything else was buried in the blue abyss. It was so hard to believe that at first Su Yi thought he was just seeing hallucinations after last night's drinking. Unfortunately, these hallucinations were very persistent and were not going anywhere. No matter how much our hero closed his eyes, the view outside the window didn't change a bit. The realization of the reality of what was happening hit him like lightning. He jumped away from the window in horror. This is not a hallucination or a dream. Now this is the cruel reality in which he lives. Everything fell into place, and it became immediately clear why the entire floor of his apartment was in water. But still, the question remained. Could Su Yi have gotten so drunk yesterday that he didn't notice that the whole city had gone underwater? The first thing that came to his mind was to look for other survivors. Maybe some of his neighbors were still in their apartments and could tell him what had happened. Su Yi went to the first door along the hallway and started knocking, asking if anyone was home. No one answered, but he kept knocking, demanding a response. Suddenly, the door opened on its own, all because it was simply unlocked. Inside, he was greeted by chaos and scattered things. Apparently, his neighbors were packing in a hurry. There were no people inside, and the dog, which always prevented our hero from sleeping with its barking and howling, was also gone. It felt like this room had been abandoned long ago. Still, Su Yi thought it was strange that it was the first time in the history of their city to be hit by such a massive flood in just one night. Judging by the scattered belongings and the state in which everything was left, the neighbors, as soon as they heard about what was happening, immediately rushed desperately to escape, throwing everything over and forgetting to close the door. And it turns out that only our hero, because of the fact that he was sleeping rough after a drunken binge, remained the only one in the whole building, while the others fled to a safer place. Although, if you take a closer look and think about it, that can't be the case. Even if they escaped yesterday, how could there be such a thick layer of dust here? And the food couldn't have spoiled so quickly. It's like it's been weeks since they left the apartment. In fact, it was hard to imagine that even a massive flood could submerge an entire city in a miserable half a day. Su Yi had a faint hope for a phone, but unfortunately, there was no signal, and even the emergency services didn't answer. The whole thing was strange. Was our hero the only one left here? Well, even if he wasn't going to give up. Even if he had no idea what had happened, he wasn't going to do nothing. First, we had to find out if there was any way out. Of course, the elevator didn't work. And as it turned out, the stairs were flooded too. The water had gotten all the way to the top floor. It was cold to the touch and seemed lifeless at first glance. However, as soon as he lightly touched the water, a few meters away from our hero, it boiled. This was something he hadn't expected. A dark shadow began to float to the surface. A human head appeared from the water and startled Su Yi. It was a dead woman, and one look was enough to realize that there was something wrong with the corpse. It was floating to the surface, and as soon as her mouth was out of the water, it opened and 4 tongues emerged at once, or red petals of a strange plant. Su Yi could do nothing but stare in horror as the rest of her body also floated to the surface of the water. From the woman's chest, something resembling tongues also burst out. It now looked as if some sort of parasite was now living inside her. Su Yi realized in horror that this woman was the resident of the 29th floor. Su Yi froze at the sight of the dead body. He was still not at all used to such common apocalypse attributes as dead bodies. However, he couldn't take his eyes off the body, and concluded that it looked like it had been underwater for several days and was now swollen. There were inhuman features on the body. And another thing Su Yi noticed was that her hands had been chewed by something. Only the bones of the hand remained. This could mean that there were fish in the water. Or worst of all, something much worse than fish. Something different and terrible. Monsters of the deep that lurk below and await careless prey, and the darkness below moved suspiciously, confirming our hero's hunch. So there was no way out, at least not here. In that case, it was necessary first of all to take care of survival here at least for some time, and to gather the necessary supplies. The most important were food supplies, and it was important that they had a long shelf life. Next, it was necessary to find weapons for self-defense and necessary tools. Dry and clean clothes were also needed. Su Yi also did not forget about the need for fire sources and stocked up on them properly. In short, he needed to imagine that he was on an uninhabited island with limited supplies. But surviving here was only part of the problem. His main concern now was a plan to escape from here. There were several options for that. The first was to just stay here, live quietly, and wait for rescue. He could climb on the roof and set fire to some junk in order to signal for help with smoke. In parallel, it will also be necessary to go through the apartments of neighbors and see if they still have some supplies. Eventually, if he was lucky, he would be found and rescued. If not, everything would finally go underwater and he would become fish food. That's quite a prospect, to be honest, It was all down to chance and luck, so Su Yi couldn't rely only on this option. The second option was more interesting. He had to make a raft. This was also a risky journey, but as a desperate measure, it was quite suitable. Therefore, Su Yi decided that when he had used up 75% of his supplies, he would take a risk and try to get out of here on a raft in search of rescue. But first he had to try the first option, and for that he had to light a fire on the roof. And just trust in fate. Maybe after the apocalypse it would smile on him. As soon as he entered the corridor leading to the roof, Su Yi froze in surprise. There were footprints under the water. Human footprints. However, Su Yi was in no hurry to rejoice. Of course, it would be great if he wasn't the only survivor in the building, but there was one fact that frightened him. This someone had gotten here through the flooded staircase and entered the apartment of the couple that our hero had been in a couple hours ago. The question remained, how did he get here through the flooded staircase? He had to prepare for the worst. And before facing this stranger, Su Yi went to his room and armed himself properly. He was carrying the classic survivor's starter kit of a hammer and a butcher knife. The weapons gave Su Yi confidence, and he approached that apartment and asked if there was anyone alive inside. The sound of footsteps on the water and rustling came from the room. There was definitely someone inside. But the question remained, if it was indeed a living person, then why didn't he answer? Finally, a rotted foot emerged from the darkness. It was some kind of zombie woman, and she could already smell fresh flesh. When she looked out from around the corner, Su Yi immediately realized that things were bad. But before he could regain his senses, the zombie had already jumped. The darkness was not a problem for the zombie, but because of the darkness, Su Yi could not react in time, and it jumped straight at him. She was too close, and her crooked, chipped teeth were already snapping near our hero's face. Then Su Yi screamed that he wasn't going to die, and gathering his strength, pushed her further away with his foot. Of course, that didn't stop her, and after barely getting back on her feet, she rushed forward again. This time, Su Yi was already ready to use his weapon. As soon as she got close enough, she immediately received a refreshing hammer blow on her head. Surprisingly, it was enough to put this zombie to rest forever. Su Yi was unpleasantly surprised by the fact that there were zombies in the world, and wondered if it could be due to the mutation caused by the flood. Suddenly the zombie corpse glowed with a blue glow, and a system window appeared in front of our hero, saying that he had received 1 spiritual source out of 5. Of course he had no idea what it was. Where could this system window come from, like some game, and what did the spirit source mean after all? Suddenly he felt his body fill with power, even the hammer in his hand became lighter. He himself was now glowing with the blue light that the dead zombie had glowed with a moment ago. Su Yi had the feeling that something had been absorbed into him. Had he earned a unit of this spirit source for killing the zombie? Apparently, this spirit source had an effect on his body, as the spot he had bruised during the battle no longer hurt. Moreover, all the fatigue was gone and Su Yi felt a kind of surge of energy. Even his strength had increased. Now he had to figure out what to do with the zombie corpse. He couldn't just leave it lying there, in case it would come to life again at night. The solution came naturally. He decided to feed that shadow floating near the exit. So he took the zombie by the leg and dragged it away. It seems the world has become a very different place, and it's a world he'll have to survive in. The Walking Dead, mysterious abilities, an unknown spirit source, and who knows what else. There was no way to explain what was happening in terms of common sense. It was unknown whether the changes that happened to this woman were accidental or imminent. But if all the corpses in the neighborhood looked like her now, then the city must have become an extremely dangerous place. After all, it was even hard to imagine how many people had died in the flood. Probably millions. In that case, it wasn't even a place that was safe. It was necessary to go out to rescuers as soon as possible. Su Yi climbed out onto the roof and gathered a pile of trash for the fire there. He also looked around again, and even though he had seen this sight many times before, he could barely contain his fear. How big the flood must be for the consequences to be so terrifying. Su Yi looked at the neighboring building, which also had 30 floors, and wondered if there were any survivors like him. But he wasn't going to puzzle over it for long. He would find out soon anyway. Su Yi quickly lit the signal fire and watched it burn brightly with hope. Unfortunately, time was passing, and the fire was almost burned out and nothing was happening. If there were any survivors nearby, they must have reacted upon seeing the thick smoke rising from the roof of his building. Indeed, the column of black smoke was visible very well, and surely many kilometers away. But the fire had finished burning and nothing happened. Even after half an hour, there was still a crashing silence around, broken only by the sound of the waves. The frustrated Su Yi began to walk back down, calculating that he only had enough food supplies for 4 days. Before he had gone a little way, he was forced to stop. There was water in his path, although he clearly remembered that when he first came here, the water had not reached the 30th floor yet. Now the entire section was flooded, so the water level was still rising. And even on the 30th floor, it wasn't safe to stay. Time was now playing against our hero, and he needed to build a raft as soon as possible. Su Yi didn't know what fate would prepare him tomorrow, so he had to be ready. Our hero immediately got down to work. and after just a few hours, he was already sighing after a successful job. Sui made a raft out of a few door frames, a bed frame, and a couple of drawers. Such a structure should be able to hold up to 300 kilograms. Fortunately, Sui already had experience in boat handling, as he had participated in boat races during his student days. And if he could make another paddle, he would surely be able to swim to the neighboring building. As a paddle, he decided to use a clothes hanger he found in one of the apartments. Before heading back to the raft, he looked out the window and lingered a bit longer. There he saw another drowning zombie that seemed lifeless and dangling among the waves. There had been no zombies here before. He remembered that well. Had the usual corpses mutated so quickly? Well, while the water level had not yet risen, Suyi could use his height advantage to finish off the zombie before it got in. To do so, he attached a hammer to a hanger, and tried using the other end of the hanger to drag it closer. The zombie immediately came to life and tried to bite the hanger. Sui had expected such a twist. But then something strange happened. After the zombie moved, something dragged him under the water. Our hero didn't realize what was happening. And what's drowning this poor dead guy? The poor guy tried to fight back, but it didn't work. And long dark shadows dragged him down to the depths where no sunlight could reach. Only air bubbles remained where the zombie had been a moment ago. Sui was horrified by what he saw. He was so frightened that he quickly slammed the window shut and tried to catch his breath in terror. In this cursed water, besides corpses, there was something else much scarier lurking in the water. He remembered that the first corpse of a woman he had seen had bite marks. Now the safety of the raft he had worked so hard to build, hoping to leave this place as quickly as possible, was doubtful. If he tried to swim to another building on the raft, the aggressive creatures from the water could drown him before he could reach his goal. But staying here is not an option either. There's only 4 days worth of food left, and that's not to mention the fact that the water level is still rising and there are still many corpses that can mutate. Sui didn't have a moment's peace. Soon, lifeless hands started knocking and beating on the door of his apartment. Immersed in his musings, our hero only jinxed it. While he sat quietly, the zombie lost interest in his door and went to try to break through the other one. Sui decided to take a look. As expected, it was another zombie. It looked suspiciously like the one he saw in the water recently. His leg was broken. Those underwater creatures had almost chewed it off. But there was no telling how it would affect his mobility. Therefore, Sui decided to act and attack first. If he didn't, the zombie would still come to him. And now was the perfect moment for a sneak attack. The zombie only had time to roar one last time, before dropping dead after a precise hammer blow. 1 blow equals 1 dead zombie. That's quite a good efficiency. As Sui expected, he guessed correctly, and a system window appeared after killing the zombie. The progress of the spiritual source had now increased to 2 out of 5. It was just as he had thought. He had become stronger again. This meant that if he continued to kill these mutated corpses and obtain spiritual source levels, he could become even stronger. In that case, Suyi would have a hope of defeating not only ordinary zombies, but also those mysterious underwater creatures, and eventually cross the flooded area and escape. However, he still didn't know what this spiritual source meant. He had already gotten 2, but the question remained, what would happen when he got all 5? Behind him he heard the sound of breaking glass. With such an influx of opponents, our hero would find out soon enough. A zombie had broken the window in his bedroom. Like the previous one, he was bitten all over, but it didn't bother him a bit. Driven by endless hunger, he moved forward. This zombie was different from the previous ones. It was strong enough to break the aluminum glass window. But that didn't mean anything. Sui had to kill it to survive. The epic battle began. Zombie versus human, hammer versus bone. Who would win? But his attack never reached its target, as the zombie was able to grab his weapon without any problem. As Sui expected, this zombie was indeed stronger and more agile than the previous one. To say the least, he was even able to block its attack with his hand, which was a sign of his primitive martial skills. Had he not received the second spiritual source that increased his strength, his defeat would have been guaranteed. Fortunately, as long as he felt that he could fight the zombie on equal footing, that meant he had a chance of winning. But it only seemed that way. In the next moment, he had already given the zombie a leg kick. In Suyi's opinion, this should have been enough to at least make the zombie retreat. But it didn't work at all. The zombie stared at his leg disdainfully, as if asking what the hell he was going to do. Suyi's plan was doomed to failure from the beginning, because he did not take into account that zombies were not afraid of pain, and such kicks did not hurt them at all. Unfortunately, Suyi didn't have this ability, and he could feel the pain perfectly. In the next instant, the zombie sent him flying with its kick. Hitting the closet with force, our hero shattered the closet. Lying under the pile of clothes, Suyi coughed and breathed heavily. The damage from the blow was worse than he could have imagined. The pain was so intense that he thought the zombie had broken several of his ribs. But the worst part was that it was far from over. He was hurt and still weak, and the zombie kept coming. Was this really the end, and he was going to die like this? It was as if time had slowed down. Suyi did not want to die at all. Not too long ago, he was able to get a good job, and his life was finally starting to get better. In addition, it looked like he was one of the few lucky ones to survive this disaster. It would be a great shame to die for nothing. At that moment, our hero made a firm decision. He had to stay alive at all costs. Although the zombie was stronger than him, Su-Yi still had a well-functioning brain, which he decided to take advantage of. Grabbing his clothes, our hero froze waiting for the zombie to fall into his trap. Millions of years of evolution for one moment. As soon as the zombie stepped on the cloth, Su-Yi put his plan into action. Unexpectedly, the zombie lost its balance and started to fall. For our hero, this was a chance. He immediately rushed at the zombie with a hammer in his hands. Fortunately, hammer blows, unlike kicks, very rarely failed. Just one blow was enough to make the zombie fall to the ground, and this time it looked like it was really dead. Once it was over, Su-Yi could finally exhale a sigh of relief. He was able to survive, and that was the most important thing. For killing the zombie, he had obtained another spirit source, and now he only had 2 more to obtain. Su-Yi also discovered that the spiritual source had healing power, as the wounds he had received during the battle with the zombies had already disappeared. This was just what he needed, because otherwise he would probably just die. But it didn't end there. Suddenly, our hero heard some noise behind him. It was the zombies again, and this time there were 2 of them. With a fierce roar, they rushed toward Su-Yi. However, this time our hero had even more strength, and he was able to deal with the first zombie with a single blow without much difficulty. Unfortunately, the second zombie was able to get close to him and grab his arm. But even in this seemingly hopeless situation, the hammer did its job perfectly, and mercilessly touched the heads of the zombies. This time the zombie finally died. After he fell to the floor with a thud, there was a long-awaited silence. But it didn't last long, as in the next moment, Su-Yi started receiving notifications that he had successfully collected 5 spiritual sources and had leveled up. Now he obtained a level 1 physic, and to level up to the next level, he needed to obtain 10 spiritual sources. Thanks to the level up, our hero was already feeling much better than before, but even that wasn't all the benefits. A system window appeared in front of him with 2 available enhancement options, stomach and lungs. Both of these enhancements were very useful during the apocalypse, for which Su-Yi couldn't help but think twice. But since there was water everywhere and there was a risk that he would end up in the water, the lung volume was clearly more useful. That was why he resolutely chose to strengthen his lungs. The system immediately began to reinforce. In the process, he began to glow brightly and his entire body was pierced with pain. Some strange energy began to flow into his lungs, expanding and strengthening them. It was quite a painful process, but in Su-Yi's opinion, this pain was worth it. Once it was over, he finally opened his eyes. He could really feel that his lung volume had increased compared to before. It felt like he could now hold his breath for at least 3 minutes. Su-Yi had hope, because now that he could evolve, surviving in this harsh and cruel world didn't seem like such an impossible task. According to his assumptions, if he collected 10 more spiritual sources, he would once again receive a single enhancement. In that case, his chances of getting out of here would increase even more. However, it was too early to think about that, and first he had to find a new place to live. This room was no longer livable, so Su-Yi decided to sleep in a neighboring apartment. At the end of this busy day, he made a decision. He would definitely get the hell out of here as soon as he got the next improvement. A big splash is heard and Su-Yi falls into the water. As he is drowning, he hears a voice telling him to get stronger. Hearing this, Su-Yi comes to his senses and wonders what is happening, why he is drowning. But as he sinks even more, a giant hand appears underneath him. Su-Yi lands on the hand and looks at the giant cloaked figure standing in front of him. The mysterious figure was telling him to become stronger. Our hero asks him who he is, but he only says that he was waiting for him at that place. From his answer, our hero managed to understand very little, and he again tried to say something to the statue. But suddenly he opens his eyes and realizes that it was all a dream. Su-Yi was completely bewildered by what had happened, but now he had bigger problems. There was a huge shadow looming over him, which could only mean one thing: there was someone behind him. He turned around to look, but what he saw instantly threw him into fear and shock. A giant toad-like creature with demonic red eyes was staring at him from behind the window. A huge monster with a long tongue staring at you isn't a picture you want to see when you wake up. However, Su-Yi had no choice. It was the first time he had seen such a big monster, so he assumed that it was the creature that had nibbled the corpse he had seen earlier. Our hero realized that his only chance to get out of here was to kill this monster. The creature knew that he was here and would surely attack him if he tried to swim to the other buildings. But for now, Su-Yi wasn't confident in his strength, and decided that the best solution would be to wait and get some more spiritual sources. And once he was strong enough, he would lure the monster out and finish it off. But making any plans in the apocalypse wasn't the best idea. The monster didn't care at all what Su-Yi was planning. It had its own vision for the future, which was to break the window and eat the guy. From the cracks on the window, Su-Yi realized that it wouldn't last long. Although the frog monster didn't manage to break it the first time, but it clearly didn't intend to stop there. The monster relentlessly continued its attempts to break the window while Su Yi tried his best to stop it. At some point, when the monster jumped back into the water, our hero had a hope that everything was over. But he was wrong. Just a moment later, the frog monster appeared again, and this time it managed to finally smash him. Su Yi found himself face to face with the terrifying monster. He realized that the monster was much stronger than him, and he would not be able to deal with it easily. However, he had no choice but to try to hit it with his hammer. The monster frog wasn't going to stand idly by either, and attacked with its long tongue. Even a hammer loses at some point. The monster's tongue was faster, causing Su Yi to be sealed into the door. As it turned out, he wasn't even close to being a match for that vile frog. What could a person armed with only a hammer do to such a monster? Su Yi didn't know what to say to this question, but he still didn't plan to give up. One of the rules of survival in the apocalypse was to use whatever was at hand. Without thinking long, Su Yi grabbed a bed and threw it at the monster. As expected, it did not do any damage to the monster at all. However, that wasn't our hero's goal either. All he needed was to distract the creature so that it would have time to escape. Su Yi did not think of anything else but to hide in the bathtub. He hoped that because of the tight space, the monster would not be able to get to him. Meanwhile, the monster frog was scurrying around the house looking for him. Su Yi had to hold his breath and hope that it would not find him and just leave. But the miracle did not happen, and the next moment in front of our hero appeared a huge monster mouth. Because of its size, the monster could not reach him, but his tongue could do it. However, trying to get through such a narrow opening, the frog has already signed his own sentence. Stuck in the doorway, it became completely defenseless. Shouting furiously that he would pay for trespassing, Su Yi attacked the monster with a butcher knife with all his might. The irony of the situation was that he himself was trespassing into someone else's property. But that was just unnecessary details. The blow came right on the eye, and the knife pierced the flesh without much trouble. In the next instant, green blood gushed out, and the monster frog let out a heartbreaking scream. The color of the eye changed, causing Su Yi to assume that the monster was dead. However, our hero had seen quite a few movies in the past where heroes had paid for their carelessness, so he decided to make sure it was dead. He was again on the cusp of death, but this time he was lucky and everything ended well. In addition, as a reward for killing the monster frog, he received as many as 8 spiritual sources, which was a good return on his efforts. As soon as the spiritual sources fused with his body, Su Yi felt a surge of strength. His strength had increased significantly again, and killing the monster would be much easier now. But suddenly his attention was caught by the frog's eye, from which a glowing blue orb began to appear. After popping out of the monster's eye, the ball flew straight towards Su Yi, which Su Yi couldn't help but be surprised by. The orb merged with his head without any help. Naturally, our hero was puzzled by what was happening. Although this orb looked like a spiritual source, Su Yi felt that it was something else. But once the system information window appeared in front of him, everything fell into place. It was an incomplete peeking rune that gave him the ability to spy on spirit beasts and obtain basic information about them. The evolution section also stated that the rune could evolve to a third eye with unknown abilities. After reading this, our hero was finally convinced that the risk was worth it, because not only did he get spiritual sources, but also a new ability. According to the information the system provided, the rune could be used to obtain information about spirit beasts. And the first thing Su Yi decided to do was to test it on a frog. As soon as he activated the peeking rune, a glowing sign appeared on its head. The rune really worked, and our hero recognized that in front of him lay the body of a cyclops frog. This species was part of the elite group of level 1 spirit beasts, and mainly fed on inferior corpse animals. These frogs had a violent temper. Once they spotted their prey, they would never retreat. There was a possibility of evolving into a cyclops frog king. To Su Yi's surprise, the frog was indeed an elite monster. However, it was still unclear what the principle of increasing the skill level of this monster was. Flood, undead, monsters, and spiritual sources suddenly appeared. Right now, there was a truly incredible change in the world. What was once called common sense had no meaning now. However, there was also something that hadn't changed. He had only one life as before, but the dangers and risks of dying were much more. That was why he had to be very careful, and he had to get out at all costs and find out what was going on outside. The third day of the flood had arrived. In these 3 days, the rules of this world had completely changed. Su Yi's main task now was to obtain spiritual sources. Only by adapting to the apocalypse conditions and becoming stronger would he have a chance to survive. During the previous night, zombies had fled to the frog's corpse and started devouring it. Su Yi already knew how to use his new rune, so he activated it to test his victims. Unfortunately, all of the zombies turned out to be of low rank. From the information provided, he was also able to learn that they had a certain probability of evolving if they devoured their own kind. But even so, it was still something he needed, for he just needed 2 spiritual sources to get an upgrade again. His strength and agility were much higher than before, so it wasn't difficult for him to deal with all the zombies in an instant. In the end, Suyi was successfully able to obtain the spirit sources he needed. Without wasting any time, he immediately started upgrading. After completing it, the system informed him that he had become a level 2 psychic, and the spiritual sources needed for the next improvement were already 20. After the enhancement, just like last time, our hero had a choice of body parts to upgrade. In addition to his stomach and lungs, this time there was also an opportunity to strengthen his muscles. At this point, Suyi could already hold his breath for at least 4 minutes, but the problem was that he could encounter something very terrible in the water, and it would be of no use at all. Reasoning this way, he made decisions to improve his muscles this time. Strengthening his muscles meant more muscle mass, more strength, better muscle control, and better durability. Therefore, he had no doubts about his choice. In the next instant, Suyi felt a previously unknown feeling. The surge of strength as well as the increase in strength was nothing compared to when he had absorbed the spiritual sources. Now his strength as well as his ability to control his body had greatly increased. He could freely feel every muscle in his body. With great strength comes great responsibility. It was with these words that Suyi set out with the hammer in his hands to crush the zombies. He was eager to test his new skills, and luckily he didn't have to look for a sparring partner for a long time. To be exact, not a partner, but rather a punching bag. As expected, the zombie was defeated with just one punch. Suyi, on the other hand, was not accustomed to exerting too much force and could hardly stand on his feet. This strength was definitely what he needed, and now with it, he could continue moving forward. In just a few seconds, he had dealt with the remaining walking dead, which was a good practice to get used to the new power. However, to Suyi's surprise, after killing them, he still hadn't obtained a single spiritual source. But that didn't upset him too much. He realized that the level of these zombies was not high enough to raise his level. He needed to look for stronger opponents, and for that, he needed to finally come out of the shadows and stop hoping for something. It was today that he had to finish the raft and get the hell out of here. After gathering the necessary supplies and equipment, Suyi set off on his first journey. Although it wasn't that big, and his goal was just a neighboring building, it was very important in terms of research and discovery. A small step for a man, and a huge one for all of humanity. But even such a distance of a few tens of meters was not on a joke frightening, because our hero did not know what was under the water and what kind of monster he could meet. But he didn't have much choice, because on that building he would probably have starved to death sooner or later. After finally reaching the building, Suyi first thing he did was to break the window. It was through this window that he planned to sneak in. Now he was facing the unknown, in which many different dangers could lurk. He didn't know what awaited him inside, but he had to move forward. After finding no signs of life in the room, Suyi finally decided to climb inside. There was the same thick layer of dust on the furniture as his neighbors. In the next room, the situation was similar. It was clear that someone had long since left this place. Unfortunately, all the food that had been there had already spoiled. But our hero still had hope that people might have managed to escape to the roof. However, suddenly Suyi's attention was attracted by the strong smell of spoiled blood that came from the neighboring room. Deciding to check, he cautiously opened the door. Inside, a not-so-pleasant sight awaited him. In a pool of blood lay the corpses of several zombies. It is important to clarify that these were not living people, but zombies that someone had killed. The question was, who killed them? It was unlikely that the monsters would attack each other, so Suyi had a hope that there might be survivors like him hiding in this building. To check this, he immediately activated his peeking rune. As he searched the building, he came across quite a large number of more dead zombies. Based on the number of them, Suyi assumed that the person who did this must have been a spiritual source carrier like him as well. However, it was still unclear whether he was still here or not. After finding a locked apartment, he started knocking and asking if there was someone inside. He got no answer, but suddenly noticed a key lying on the ground. When he opened the door and went inside, he found a dead man lying on the floor with a baseball bat in his hands. Most likely, it was with it that he had managed to deal with all the evil. The peeking rune didn't identify him as a walking dead body, which meant he was the survivor. It was obvious from the huge claw marks on his shirt that he had been defeated by a monster like that giant frog. And perhaps if he had arrived a little earlier, he might have survived. However, now it was not important. The past could not be returned. Therefore, our hero decided to inherit his weapon and continue fighting. However, suddenly, his rune reacted to the living creature and glowed with a bright light. The very next moment, Suyi heard some faint sounds coming from the closet. Walking over to it, he cautiously started to open the door. There was no telling what was in there, so extra caution would not hurt. Holding his breath for a moment, Suyi swung the door open with a sharp movement and prepared to attack if necessary. But as it turned out, there was no need. From what he saw, our hero's eyes opened wide with surprise. In the closet in front of him sat a little girl who was looking at him with a blank stare.